guys, welcome back. In the previous video, Loving and Losing Laci Part 1, I mentioned a few topics that we would revisit. If you haven't watched Part 1, I encourage you to check it out as it does give a more detailed summary of the case rather, in this one we will be diving into a few key topics. But before we jump in, I do want to state that pretending victims are perfect in death does not contribute anything positive from the tragedy, especially if we need to study the full family dynamics so we can better understand the case and the crime. In this video, we will be discussing sensitive information, not to lessen the impact of the crime, rather to discuss different angles that may or may not have been explored during the trial. I challenge each of you to keep an open mind and an objective view. Please keep comments respectful and informative. Let's get started. Why do we continue to study these cases? Research shows that the killing of women and girls by intimate partners does not result from random or spontaneous acts. It is therefore useful to identify and analyze the factors that precede such killings, along with the traits and characteristics of the perpetrators, among whom considerable gender differences exist. This is found in the Global Study on Homicide, Gender-Related Killing of Women and Girls. I will link the full case study below in the description. It was very, very informative. Just a quick refresher of the case, Laci Denise Peterson went missing Christmas Eve 2002. This was long before the current influence of social media, and the news channels were revamping their scheduling formats. So while this period in history was void of social media, it was pioneering the way we view the news today with 24-hour coverage and true crime. Scott returned home after a fishing trip to discover Laci was not home. This is the story we're told. Once he was home, he grabbed some pizza, took a shower, and moved a mop bucket. Then, when he got out and realized Laci still wasn't there, he called Sharon, Laci's mother. I think we all can agree a phone call like that would absolutely overwhelm a parent with fear and worry. The search for Laci began rather immediately, with Ron first placing the 911 call.
Emergency dispatch. How can I help you?
Yes, my son-in-law called. He went playing golf this morning at 9:30. My daughter's been missing since this morning. She's 8 months pregnant. She took her dog for a walk in the park. The dog came home with just a leash on.
So the dog came back without your daughter?
Right.
Okay, what is your address, sister?
Well, I'm at...
Is that where she's...
So it's over at Maloma Park is where she went for the walk. What is Scott Lake address? I can't remember.
What's your cell phone number, sir, in case you get disconnected?
It's 404. Jesus, I can't believe I'm going for it. 404.
Okay, so what's the address where she lives and she's missing from?
Her address is...
Is that between Encina and Edgeworth Drive?
Yeah.
Okay, is that a house? What is your name?
My name is Ron. I'm her stepdad.
Okay, what is your name? Your last
Gransky.
Gransky?
Ranski. Her husband, Scott Peterson, is on his way over to the park to try to...
What's your stepdaughter's name?
Scott Peterson?
No, your stepdaughter.
Laci Peterson.
Laci, Peterson, right?
Peterson.
And she's white, black, Hispanic, Asian?
She's Portuguese and white.
How old is she?
She's 26.
What time did she leave the house and didn't come back?
That we don't know. We just got a call from our son-in-law. Said he left this morning at 9:30 to play golf. He just got home about a half hour ago. Nowhere around.
Okay, so she went to walk the dog with?
Walked it in that park, at the Maloma Park. What's that park over there with the call? Yeah. Yes, it's one under Phoenix over there, by the tennis court. Okay.
That's on Encina?
Yeah, do you have a flashlight? Absolutely.
And she's 8 months pregnant, you said?
Pardon?
You said she's 8 months pregnant?
Yes, ma'am. Can you get a point card for me over there? Is that possible?
Is this over there at Dry Creek Park?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Is that over there at Dry Creek Park?
Yes, that's what it is. I don't know. I don't know. She's 8 months pregnant. There can't be that many people. She's got short black hair. She's about 5'1".
Hold on, she's 5'1"?
Yeah. Dark eyes.
Dark hair and eyes?
Yes.
So the dog came home without the leash, right?
The dog came home on the leash without her. Okay, you're gonna. So her husband's looking for her right now. Are you gonna stay here at that? I'll stay here if I have, yes, if I have to stay here.
So we're gonna send an officer over there as soon as they're available. Okay, you're at right now.
Okay, good.
What's the phone number there, sir?
Okay, my house number is
No, where you're at. Is that where you live at Markley Way? Okay.
my house.
What's your phone number? Mm-hmm. Okay, and her husband's name was?
Scott.
Scott Peterson. Do you know what he's wearing?
No, he just called me from the house. I have no idea. He's walking, he's going over there looking for him. He's not in
Okay. What's her home phone number there?
her house number,
Mm-hmm.
it's
Okay, we'll have someone out there as soon as they're available.
let me give you the cell phone. He might have his cell phone with him.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll have someone out there as soon as they're available, Ron. Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll have someone out there as soon as they're available.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Sharon and Laci's friends drove immediately to her home and to the park where she typically walked their dog, Mackenzie. The search snowballed with air and equestrian searches to follow. Tips poured in, but the one that would send this case into the ultimate media vacuum was when Amber Fry put the pieces together and discovered that the man she was falling in love with had a pregnant wife that was missing. This dirty little secret was about to expose an area of the seemingly perfect couple's marriage that was broken, and the motive became Scott killing Laci and baby Connor to be with his mistress. Detectives leaned in hard and fast when it came to Scott Peterson. From the night Laci went missing, Detective Brocchini sat down with Scott to interview him, which he tells reporters he has rarely done. It's during this interview with Scott when he produces his trip ticket from the marina. It's often seen as a sign of premeditation, but it could have just as easily been, like a wadded up piece of paper sitting in his jacket. And he knew that he had it on him. So when the detective asked him about his whereabouts and if anyone saw him, I was like, oh, well, it's in my pocket, so here it is. So in my opinion, it makes sense to produce a receipt if you have one. What are your thoughts on that? I know my own father, being a fisherman, always threw his trip tickets on the dash because my mother would often have to go and retrieve them for her tax records. If you have any commercial fishermen in your family, you know all about that. Those things end up everywhere. So another question I raise is, would it make more sense for it to be in his pocket or the dash, or does it even matter? A topic I do want to highlight in this video is the question of reporting or telling someone about previous issues within a marriage. I'm going to use the term marriage, however, it should be noted that it doesn't exclude those relationships that are male-female and unmarried. We see in this video clip where Scott is asked if Laci knew about the affair. Let's take a moment and listen.
Did it cause a rupture in the marriage?
It was not a positive, obviously. It's inappropriate. But it was not something that we weren't dealing with
A lot of arguing?
No, no. No, I can't say that even, she was okay with the idea. But it wasn't anything that would break us apart.
There wasn't a lot of anger?
No.
Do you really expect people to believe that an 8.5-month pregnant woman learns her husband has had an affair and is saintly and casual about it? Accommodating? Makes a peace with it?
Well, you don't know. No one knows our relationship but us. And that's at peace with it, not happy about it.
Why did you tell her?
Early December.
Did it cause a rupture in the marriage?
It was not a positive, obviously. It's inappropriate. But it was not something that we weren't dealing with.
A lot of arguing?
No. I can't say that even, she was okay with.
It's argumentative if Scott was telling the truth about if Laci knew or suspected the affair. Her family and friends have reported that if she knew about the affair, she surely would have told them. This is one area where I would have to disagree with their assumption. Let's look at the case study regarding underreporting and the reasons given for not reporting DV. This also correlates with the common motives for homicide. These were both included in the research global study on homicide, and the link again is in the description below. So it's going to be a little bit of a recap in the beginning, but bear with me. Here we read, research shows that the killing of women and girls by intimate partners does not result from random or spontaneous acts. It is therefore useful to identify and analyze the factors that precede such killings, along with the traits and characteristics of the perpetrators, among whom considerable gender differences exist. For example, male and female perpetrators of intimate partner homicides seem to belong to this distinct group, not only in terms of prevalence rates, but also in terms of the motivations behind the offense. Motivations typically reported by men include possessiveness, jealousy, and fear of abandonment, which, in my opinion, the fear of abandonment comes into play in this case, while motivations report by women related to extended periods of suffering physical violence. A recent Australian study on intimate partner homicide concluded that the majority of such homicides, 80% of them, involved men killing a current or former intimate partner. Nearly a quarter of such men were known to the authorities for having been violent towards their intimate partners in the past. It was also found that almost half of the men killed their partner within 3 months of the relationship ending. I do believe that's something to be discussed as well, once we take a look at the timeline of Laci's progressing pregnancy and his connection with Amber. A couple of things that stand out here. Jackie Peterson, Scott's mother, received some unexpected surprises not long before Scott and Laci's wedding. During this time, 2 adults, 1 man, Don, and a woman named Anne, reached out to their birth mother, Jackie, to reconnect. This completely took Laci by surprise, and it's noted in Sharon Roach's book, For Laci, that Laci felt as if Jackie had been lying or living a lie because she presented herself in such a light, but then kept, the secret of her previous children completely under wraps. And I have to question, did Scott feel the same way? So it's said that the reason Jackie gave them up was because the pregnancies were unplanned and she couldn't provide for them as a single woman. Now, I'm a strong advocate for adoption and birth control. I very much understand the impact of an unplanned pregnancy, what it can have on the woman as well as the child. And it's important to note that what causes it. And make sure that, you're taking the precautions that you need for it not to happen again if possible. And again, this is just my opinion. It's not to pass judgment or anything of that sort, but I do say it being a sister of 5 adopted children whom my parents adopted out of the foster care system. And I will tell you, I'm the baby of 3. Like, I'm the baby of the biological 3, and then my parents adopted the 5 siblings from foster care. And I will have to say that they grew up and they experienced many difficult complexities that resulted from each of them processing their realities as they got older. So is it, adoption can be absolutely beautiful? Yes, it can be. But it was also not the happiest journey that you see painted on television, because what no one discusses are the questions that arise, or, in our case, they were older, and so of course there were hundreds of hours of doctor's appointments and counseling sessions and immense financial strain on my parents, which directly impacted the children in the family. So I love them dearly and they know it, but what they had to go through and what they experienced growing up feeling like someone just kept having kids and then gave them away, they still work on that. And it's affected each of them differently. So I say that because, that's an area that we don't really talk about a lot, but within the family units, especially when you're looking at crimes where, pregnancy and new babies and, homicide all come together, like, I would think that we need to be paying attention to the family histories for sure. So, the importance is to make sure that, if you can avoid having to put a child through that struggle by form of, being safe and using birth control, then that's definitely the way to go, especially here in America where we have several options. And then before anyone blasts me about birth control and argues religion, most religions frown upon premarital sex as well. So, either way you go, there's different decisions to be made. I will say that we do not know the full extent of Jackie's story, and that's okay. We can only go off of what's been told and shared before she passed, and it's also not our place to pass judgment. So again, nothing I have said has any intention whatsoever of passing judgment on the decisions that Jackie had to make. Rather, for the purposes of true crime and studying the psychological aspects of this case, it is important to note the family history. So if we look at this through the lens of the quote-unquote golden boy, as he was called by his parents, Scott was facing having a child that he very verbally expressed he did not want prior to conception. It was made known to Laci after they were married. Again, that timeline. After they were married, that Scott really didn't want to have kids. Sharon, Laci's mother, mentions in her book For Laci how it broke her heart hearing Laci crying about Scott not wanting to have children. Then almost as fast as that call concluded, the next thing she knew, Laci was announcing that they were going to try to have a baby. Scott shared with Laci early on while dating that his interests were fine wine, golfing, and traveling. Surely they discussed children at some point before they got married, because Laci always knew she wanted to be a mother, and most outgoing females are open about their dreams when it comes to children. It isn't like they only dated for a few months either. They lived together prior to getting married, and according to those who were close to them, they were indeed so in love. So what changed? Scott later told the same thing to Amber Fry, and even later on to his sister Ann's sitter. The whole, he prefers wine, golfing, and traveling. He also told Amber that he did not want any biological children but loved her daughter and was okay helping raise her. And that's according to witness for the prosecution by Amber Fry. Shampoo, rinse, repeat. Couple that reality with the statements made and Laci's personality that begins to formulate an equation for intimate partner homicide. We hear this description about Laci as we have other victims in these awful crimes. The dangers of being that type of woman or man who sets their mind on something and doesn't change it. It's a reoccurring theme that I've noticed in true crime and deeper study of each case. It's important to have one's identity and opinions noted. However, it's more important to remember that a healthy marriage or relationship is going to have a respect for each other's differences, and something as life-changing as having children is not an area where compromise can truly exist. Or is it? When you take these two areas, the unexpected truth of Jackie's decisions to, in loose terms, get rid of her situation and try again, did this somehow impact Scott to believe that he could control his outcome or the outcome of his own situation by doing away with his own son, even if it meant getting rid of the person so adamant to, in his mind, force this parenting trap? This is an area of Freud and Erikson that could seriously be a video on its own, but to summarize, it raises the question of how much of an impact did learning about his mother's early decisions to give up her babies, in some twisted sense, give him the validation for his own feelings towards baby Connor and even Laci. What are your thoughts on this?
It wasn't anything that meant anything to Scott. He was just being a young man feeling his oats. No different from 95% of the men in this country.
It's noted in court transcripts that Laci and Scott went into the pawn shop not long before her disappearance and had some jewelry appraised. It's said that during that visit, Laci forgot her driver's license and the paperwork had to be filled out again by Scott. In other words, she was either having pregnancy brain or she was irritated or distracted. The body language between them appeared to be that of annoyance. The employee notes that Laci pulled away when Scott tried to rub her belly, or I think it was like he was trying to reach around and grab her or something like that, and she pulled away from him. I know what my thoughts are on this, but I'd love to hear yours. Do you think this interaction could have been indicative of Laci suspecting or knowing something about the affair with Amber? Now, I asked this question early, but we will look at a timeline a little bit later on and maybe come back to that and then see if your decision changes or your response changes. Going back to the claim that Laci would have told her mother about the affair if she knew. While this is a comforting thought, it is proven to not be the reality between Laci and her mother. There is no doubt in my mind that Laci and Sharon were very, very close. However, we must keep in mind that there was another affair early on, back when Scott was still in college, and she kept that away from everyone. No one knew about it. We know that Laci knew about this affair because the woman came forward once Laci was missing and stated that all of the roommates at the time could corroborate her story, and investigators confirmed it with Sharon and Ron. This woman caught Scott in bed with Laci and was screaming, "He's cheating on me, he's cheating on me." And finally, one of Scott's roommates walked outside to her and told her that Laci was in fact his wife, and the person he had been cheating on was Laci, not her. Not a single word of this incident was mentioned to Sharon or her friends. She kept this all to herself. In developing countries, in particular, research has found that the most frequently mentioned reasons for not reporting violence against women includes embarrassment, the belief that reporting is pointless, the belief that gender-related violence is a normal part of that, of life that women must bear, and various concerns about the well-being of others. Research on the reporting of gender-related violence is developing across many countries and suggests that the increasing age is associated with formal reporting, which may reflect an increase in autonomy and a decrease in dependence of a male partners over time. So basically what it's saying, And this could, I know that the study is on DV. However, if we look at the case, I mean, clearly the infidelity, the affairs, the behaviors, they all lead up to the ultimate act of DV. And so when we ask the question, would Laci have told her mother or her friends about this second, not the first affair, but the second? I mean, she'd already covered up one. So would she have told them about the second one? And something to keep in mind is, not wanting to be embarrassed. Do you think, that could have played a role in it? And it also goes down to state that age plays a role in it. So the older a woman is, the more likely she is to do the actual formal reports. So it goes on to say women who were formally married as well have been found to be more likely to report gender-related violence than others, as have women in urban centers, possibly owing to better access to social, legal, and health services than in rural areas. The reluctance of women to report further contributes to the underreporting of sexual violence. This has been attributed to their lack of confidence in the criminal justice system that assigns blame to them rather than to their offenders. And I will tell you, if anyone has ever had to deal with especially like covert abuse, it's one of those things where going and reporting it, you literally feel like you're running in a circle. And no matter how much you try to prove it or how much you try to show it, it's very, very rare that someone actually believes you. So there's a lot that goes into what people keep to themselves, what they report, what they share with their friends and their families. So I do think that's worth noting in this case. Medical discoveries. As I was reviewing trial transcripts for this case, I came upon the medical document for Laci's visits to her OBGYN. Please note, these are now public documents and were released by the court to the public as part of the documents and transcripts. Having worked on OB previously, a lot of this began to jump off the page to me. So let's start at the top and work our way down. I will share with you my thoughts on trends and how different dates and symptoms could be related or could be explained. I do want to note that the name of the medication is only mentioned once. However, it appears she had a few infections throughout the pregnancy. Let's read through the notes and I'll come back to the abnormalities and share my thoughts on them afterwards. The initial visit to the clinic was done on 7/11/2002. It appears Laci went in to confirm her home pregnancy test with this appointment. As most OBGYN clinics do, they did a complete new patient well woman visit, and we see this noted. I'm going to read over the flow sheet first, and then I'll read through the narrative notes regarding that initial visit. So starting from the top, we have Laci Peterson, date of birth 5/4/1975. She was petite at 5'1" and weighs 119 pounds. She was 27 years old, and it notes 1 gravida, or number of times she had been pregnant. Her last menstrual period date was on 5/6/2002 with an estimated date of confinement, or more commonly called due date, of 2/10/2003. This was a huge point for the defense to make, especially when you consider later on the argument that if Laci knew about an affair, she would have said something. The question for the jury being, if that's the case, then why did she never tell her family that the due date changed? It could be that she simply forgot. Let's not get hung up on that just yet, but it does go to show how a medical record can or could have been used by both prosecution and defense during the trial. Let's keep going. As we review the assessment, we can see that check marks are made all under the letters WNL, which means within normal limits. So her skin, heart, lungs, peri area, all checked out just fine. Her bony pelvis was noted to be adequate for giving birth. Under the initial prenatal screen, we see the lab work that was done as well as the results. As any former pregnant woman will tell you, she lucked out on not having to take that 3-hour glucose test. That thing's a beast if you've never had to do it. Her results were 84, and you couldn't surpass 95, or you would indeed have to take that 3-hour test. Drop in the comments, ladies, if you ever had to go back and take that 3-hour test instead of just the 1 hour. I'd be curious to know which little syrup flavored drink you chose. I know I always did orange. I thought it was like a flat Sunkiss, but I mean, it really wasn't. It was like orange syrup. You know, and why bring this up? And because I like to do this in some of my videos, because it's very important to remember that she was very much an alive woman who had this outgoing personality, and she loved to cook, and she loved to mix flavors, and she just had this beaming smile and was so excited to be pregnant. And I mean, you could just almost imagine like her sitting in a waiting room and just talking to everybody that was there, you know, while they were waiting to get the rest of their lab work done, or while they were trying to drink their little juices too. I don't know. I think it's important to remember them, not just as victims, but as human beings. And I could 100% see her just beaming in a waiting room, trying to get this, you know, yucky stuff down and get this glucose test done. So anyway, as with any initial visit and most OB visits, she gave a urine sample, and it is noted here that it was positive. It doesn't say what for, but it does note a treatment was given. We will see this in more detail in a minute. Next, we have 2 ultrasound dates. This will come under scrutiny a little bit later on in the trial, because the question was, you know, how many ultrasounds was she actually given? Keeping in mind that if it's not documented, it didn't happen. The first ultrasound is noted on 7/16/2002. We see baby Connor's heart rate. Laci has no complaints or problems this visit, and a single active fetus is seen with positive cardiac movement. So they got to see the baby's heartbeat on this ultrasound. The next ultrasound documented is on 9/24/2002. This was also when the due date was changed. We can see it clearly documented at the top of the page. They even updated the flow chart, and otherwise this visit was normal. So let's look at the flow chart a little more closely. 7/11 is the initial new patient appointment. Her labs are noted above, and it's noted she received what we call the new parent packet. It's usually full of information and what's to come, lab work, you know, lab orders, all the things. And this visit also notes that she is taking over-the-counter prenatal vitamins. So she was already ready to go. 7/16. She returns for what appears to be her well woman exam. She received a pap smear, which is normal, and we see those results on the flow sheet later. She had no complaints this visit, but was concerned about spotting after the exam. This is completely normal, and she was reassured about this concern. It's noted that she is a low-risk pregnancy. We do note trace proteins in her urine. However, this can easily be explained by the physiological changes due to pregnancy, especially if there weren't any other complaints from the patient. She didn't have any that day. However, we do note a phone note to follow. On 7/17, Dr. Ed Rocky confirms Laci, in fact, had a urinary tract infection. Ampicillin 500 milligrams was called into her pharmacy on file and was instructed to take it 4 times a day for 7 days. Now, ampicillin is often prescribed during pregnancy for its use in the first trimester and can reduce the proportion of preterm birth in pregnant women with acute infectious diseases in the urinary and respiratory system. Common side effects, of course, are nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Let's discuss common causes of UTIs. Sex is a big culprit of UTIs. Constipation, which is common in pregnancy, especially with those prenatal vitamins. Uncontrolled diabetes, which her labs check out. Holding it, dehydration, feminine products, which we'll see later on she questions a change in soap. And birth control, which she's no longer taking. So this will be important to note a little later. 7 days later from that date would have been 7/24, And we should note there isn't a follow-up here or any additional contact with the patient, which usually occurs when treatment has been successful and symptoms have been resolved. 8:20. Now let's look at 8:20. We see that her gestational age is 15 weeks and 1 day. Her weight is now 128. Blood pressure looks to be about the same. She's still negative for her glucose, but she does show trace proteins in her urine. Baby's heart rate is in the 150s, it looks. She's got a little bit of edema going on, so some swelling, and still a low pregnancy risk. Discusses the lab work that she's getting done on this visit. It says ultrasound next visit, positive pelvic pressure, checked her cervix and they are closed. And she has, so her cervix are closed and short, and she has a UTI, which has been treated, and it notes to recheck the UA. So chances are, if she was having this pelvic pressure, that's probably why they went ahead and rechecked the UA again before she left. It says patient concerned with incompetent cervix due to her biopsy that she had in the past. And here it says pelvic pressure noted 1 day ago. 3 days ago on exam, her cervix was closed, but it mentions a chicken scratch measurement of how long it was. And then it says ultrasound done, no funneling, with cervix measuring 3.5 to 4.0 and intact and closed. Patient reassured, will recheck next visit, or will recheck next ultrasound in 5 weeks. Patient notified of UA results and prescription called in to her pharmacy. Now, this is now the second UTI that's noted. It notes that a prescription was called in, however, it doesn't say what antibiotic was sent in this time. And I would be interested to know what one was sent in. I know that Cipro is commonly used, but it's not usually the go-to for pregnant patients. But we will go over the symptoms of a urinary tract infection and what that could mean for you, especially if you're having reoccurring UTIs. I want to keep track of these dates, keep track of how many UTIs she gets. Let me back up for just a moment. So I'm seeing that this little date over here scribbled in as 9/5 shows that the patient was notified of UA and prescription called in. So basically what it appears happened was she went into the doctor's office on 8/20. She was having symptoms. She showed trace proteins in her urine. It looks like they rechecked her urine and note that she had previously been treated for a UTI. So they rechecked her urine, most likely sent it off for a culture. That's about the right time frame for it. It must have come back positive for a UTI, and that's when they notified the patient and they called in the antibiotics to the pharmacy. So again, 8:20, she shows up, she's feeling that pressure, she's concerned, and it does appear they did an ultrasound on 8:20 to check the cervix, and it shows no funneling, and they give a very specific 3.5 to 4.0 centimeter measurement. It's intact and the os is closed, and those are very specifics to what you would find on an ultrasound. And they want to recheck her next visit with an ultrasound in 5 weeks. Then on 9/5, they call back for the follow-up to her urinalysis and call in her prescription. This next input that we see is on 9/16/2002, and it says phone, patient calls after finishing 10-day antibiotic for UTI. Patient reports vulva burning and itching with discharge. And she does note, this is where she notes that she changed soaps and thought that may have been irritating it. And the recommendation to her at that point was Monistat, or to call back if the symptoms don't improve. Now, this is very, very common with anytime you have a urinary tract infection, you take an antibiotic, and then because the antibiotics kill the good and the bad, you end up with a yeast infection afterwards. And so, unfortunately, for those who have to go through this vicious cycle, it's no fun. And that's what appears has happened here. She has now undergone almost 3 weeks of antibiotic treatments for urinary tract infection, and now she's come down with the yeast infection, which when you're pregnant it's never, you never want to go through it anyway, but especially being pregnant. And then we're going to jump down to 9/24. And again, you see those trace proteins coming back in there, but there's no complaints at this time. She's still low risk, and the fetal heart rate's right around the same average. Blood pressure's around the same. Her weight is creeping up there, and at first I was like, oh, well, that's not that bad. It's not horrible, but keep in mind, she is 5'1". Now, these weights, when you're 5'7", 5'8", that's a little different, but she is 5'1", so I can understand their concerns at that point. However, as of 9/24, there's no complaints. Something I did want to note on that 9/24 appointment is that the presentation of the baby shows that he was breech at 20 weeks gestation. So typically the baby will turn at some point during pregnancy and become head down and ready for delivery. But at this time, baby Connor was he was sitting up. He was hanging out. By 10/29, we see that she is experiencing positive fetal movement, and at this appointment is where they discuss her weight gain and exercise. She's still demonstrating those trace proteins, but weight, heart rate, blood pressure, everything is still low risk and right on track. On 11/6, we see this phone note where a patient calls in mentioning that she's had basically like a vasovagal episode where she was feeling faint while she was walking. It notes that she typically walks for about 20 minutes, or she noticed it last week walking. So the week prior, she had an episode. Then again today, so on 11/6, she had this episode as well. It says patient walks in the morning after breakfast. Recommend patient not to exercise, and if she does, then to do it later in the day. So that we see that come back in the trial transcripts for sure. I think this begs the question too, though, at what time, if in fact, let's say Laci left to go walking Mackenzie in the park after Scott left, at what point then would be considered later in the day when she's had time to eat and, rest or whatnot. So what are your thoughts on that? Because this was a very controversial point, was that she had these dizzy spells that occurred, and then the doctor said you don't need to exercise anymore. But we can see here in this chicken scratch of a note that it does recommend that the patient not exercise, but it does leave some leniency to, if she was to do it, then she needs to do it later in the day. What are your thoughts on this? By 11/8, we see another phone note that's mentioned, and it shows that she's complaining of shortness of breath with walking, but she denies being dizzy. So at this point, it shows that, she's still walking, but she's not getting dizzy. She's just getting short of breath. And they of course offered for her to make sure, she does self-care measures, make sure she's safe when she's out walking. And I think when we look down here at 11/25, it should be noted, think about it. She started out at 119, and now she's up to 150 for her weight. And on a 5'1" petite, that's petite with weight. You're carrying a baby. And, it makes mention in one of the books about her friend teasing her that she was just starting to waddle. And that very well could have just simply been she was adjusting and adapting to carrying a growing baby, in addition to the extra weight that her body normally isn't prepared to carry. And quite a few women become short of breath later on in pregnancy because you're carrying around quite a bit. She still remains low risk, and those trace elements are still in there. You see that. And it does show that on 11/25, she reports in that she completed her Lamaze classes and that there's active fetal movement. She complains of increased sweating hands, and can discuss weight gain again. So again, this is kind of typical in later in pregnancy. I know the question was, did Scott give her something that was making her sick or, causing these types of things? It's very easy to get out there and get to walking, and your heart rate speeds up, and then your body's not used to it, and so then you're having to catch up, and then you get lightheaded or short of breath, or you get dizzy. Like, that's not unheard of with pregnancy. And especially if you've gained any type of significant weight, you could feel that. So do I think that Scott actually tried to drug her or anything? I don't particularly see that. Just my opinion looking at this, I don't see anything that indicates that in her medical records that we have presented to us. On December 23rd, this is sadly the last entry that we see, the last visit she had. She was 32 weeks, and she was, bless her heart, going through Thanksgiving. I would have gained some more too. She was 153 pounds. Her blood pressure was up just a little bit, and everything was negative when it came to her urine, and still low risk, and she had positive fetal movement, which was great. Now that we move on to the medical record from that initial visit, you'll see where Laci does note having positive symptoms of nausea, constipation, vaginal discharge, and being dizzy, all of which are normal and also off and on can be indicative of a urinary tract infection or contributing factors to one. As we scroll down, you can see that her last contraceptive that she used was from December of 2000, and she's not used any medication since then. See a little bit of family history here, paternal grandfather and her mom, both, having heart disease. So you kind of go down, get a little bit more with the positives for her, and you see where at 15 she tested positive and diagnosed with a venereal disease, and we see that listed here. See that she had to have a blood transfusion, and that she had the tumor removed with the right tube and ovary, which it's a dermoid tumor, and if you go look those things up with teeth and hair, it's disgusting. It's interesting biological dynamic, that's for sure. She's had chickenpox before, and she'd had a history of an abnormal pap smear where she had a biopsy done, and then she had some cryotherapy, and now after 6 months it's been within normal limits. She's not had an outbreak of the STI since she was 15, and it just notes her cervical history here. And then going through this, you have the genetic hereditary questionnaire, talks about, do you or the baby's father have any of X, Y, and Z? And you can see that she listed, or she checked off no for each of them. I think it's interesting to note, let's see, when you're going through some of these, when you're filling out your paperwork at the doctor's office, and it's just form after form after form. It's interesting how it starts out, it's really, really neat, and then as it goes, by the time you get down to the bottom, it's just I'm done over it. And so here we go. We scroll down a little bit and you have the dictation of the visit. So let's read through this and let's get started with the patient history. It says patient is a 26-year-old Caucasian female here for her annual GYN exam. This is her first visit to this office. The patient states she was previously on OCPs for contraception and quit in December. At this time, she is planning on pregnancy at the end of this year. The patient's GYN history is significant for a previous abnormal pap smear in 1997, followed by laser cervical cone for a history of dysplasia. This was then followed by cryotherapy 6 months after the laser cone. The patient states she then had normal pap smears since that time. She has normal menstrual cycles every month. The patient also had a previous exploratory laparotomy at age 7 years old for a possible left dermoid tumor. The patient states she had her left ovary and tube removed and the tumor contained teeth and hair. Her PCP, as primary care physician, is not established at this time. Current medications are none. The patient is married, employed as a substitute teacher, and lives in Modesto. Smoke history is denied and occasional alcohol use with approximately 4 glasses a week. She has no known allergies to medications. Family history is negative for major medical problems. Her physical notes that she is 5 feet 1 inches, weighs 125. Blood pressure is 124/78. In general, the patient is a cooperative Caucasian female in no acute distress. Pupils are equal, round, and reactive. Pharynx is benign. Neck is supple. No thyromegaly is appreciated. Lungs are clear to auscultation. Heart has regular rate and rhythm. The breasts are without distinct masses or tenderness and no nipple discharge. Monthly breast self-exam is reviewed. The abdomen is soft and non-tender with no palpable masses, no hepatosplenomegaly, and no rebound tenderness. The patient does, however, have a well-healed, extended midline vertical incision from her previous exploratory laparotomy at age 7 for removal of a probable ovarian dermoid tumor from her left adnexa. Pelvic examination shows the external genitalia without lesions. The vaginal vault and cervix are without gross lesions and no cervical motion tenderness. The uterus is normal in size and contour, mobile and non-tender. There is no adnexal mass or tenderness. Assessment, normal GYN exam. Plan, moving forward, a pap smear was collected today. GC and chlamydia, so that's gonorrhea, and chlamydia cultures were collected. It's normal. Most of the time, every woman visit, you get that done. I discussed with the patient the importance of increased folic acid in her diet. I also discussed with the patient to stop alcohol use at this time since she is planning to achieve pregnancy. She will follow up for her next annual or as needed. So I'm sure I'll be asked in the comments at some point, and that's, what's the significance of this? Urinary tract infections are common, especially with some pregnancies. It's important to note the timeline of when Scott began sleeping with Amber in this medical record. From Laci's position, she's the wife, married to a self-proclaimed horny bastard who clearly feels his world is ending because of the pregnancy. Early on, pregnancy hormones rage and the desire for physical intimacy can be pretty intense. For a husband who doesn't have a problem with intimacy during pregnancy, it's a beautiful thing. For someone who isn't, it can be a moody and lonely time. It's evident that Scott didn't just turn off his sexual desires, thus his flirtatious chatter with the mutual friend Sean Sibley, which ultimately introduced Scott to Amber. So, cycle 1, or option 1, wife gets a UTI, symptoms are painful urination, bladder sensitivity and pressure, so that lower pressure, she could feel it. Sometimes fever, abdominal distension, dizziness, cramping. It's just absolutely miserable to most people, and she starts antibiotics. Well, antibiotics make you feel puny, at least for a little bit, and then you start to feel better. Then she has intercourse or relations with her husband, and then the UTI transfers back to the wife. It does happen. Many don't realize that if you have intercourse while having an active urinary tract infection, the male can contract it, feel zero symptoms because their urethra is longer, and then pass it back essentially during intercourse. So you can have the infection, take medication, sleep with your partner, and get it right back. Like painful cycle. Cycle 2 would be every time the wife and hubby have intercourse, she gets a UTI, takes the antibiotic, then proceeds to get a yeast infection, because that's very common when you take these really intense antibiotics. And then it becomes a 3-week ordeal of pain and discomfort. So as a pregnant woman, you start to relate urinary tract infection, yeast infection, and 3 weeks of hell every time you have an intimate moment with your husband, which eventually gets to the point where you don't even want to bother. It happens to many couples, and again, I will go ahead and just put this out there. By no means does it excuse anything or any part of what he did, as far as, the affair, or if you believe he's guilty of the murder. None of it is condoning it, but I do think it's important to note. Now, let's discuss the symptoms and side effects. So, we discussed previously the side effects of the antibiotic that we see prescribed to Laci. Sometimes, when you're given a week-long course of medication and it does not resolve the infection, they'll send the urine off for a culture. It'll come back, and then the doctor usually will call in a different prescription for you. If something is going to fight it off better. So while I'm not saying that this is what she was given, these are 2 other alternatives for urinary tract infection, and that's ciprofloxacin and Bactrim DS. I won't go into a full pharmacology lesson. However, it's important to note the side effects, because we do see some of them presented in this case, like clumsiness, unsteadiness, changes in urination frequency, etc. Between medication and the reoccurring infections, it's my personal opinion that Scott did not try to drug Laci. I know it was speculated, it's kind of loosely been tossed out there, but honestly, I believe it was genuinely her being pregnant with the urinary tract infection, the weight gain on her little petite frame, that all basically added and contributed to her symptoms that we see her feeling within her medical
He
records.
was just being a young man feeling his oats. No different from 95% of the men in this country.
We know Laci was very much invested in her family and marriage. Wouldn't it be possible that these topics potentially came up over holiday meals, and this same thought process with Laci was shared? Do you think this is something she may have outwardly disagreed with, but when it came to keeping her marriage together, she believed in working through them? Knowing what we knew about the college days affair and the timing of his affair with Amber, would it have been the end-all be-all, or do you think she would have kept it quiet again due to the baby being due? Keep in mind the medical discoveries with regards to the UTIs, pregnancy, and treatments. Their intimate life, no doubt, was being paused and on hold week after week. Laci was very traditional from everything that we've studied about her. And then it's noted that Scott had a thing for some very hardcore adult films. And, those things with the affairs, it really just points to this disassociation between physical and emotional. And I believe we see this also in the interviews once Laci is reported as missing. So I'd really like to hear your opinions on this part. Please remain respectful. And so a couple of questions. Do you think that Laci would have forgiven him once again to salvage their marriage, especially for baby Connor? Or do you think this would have been the end of them? The latter, in my opinion, would prove more motive than just the affair on its own. And I do think that it's important to note that there are men who love their wives and love their families, but they continue to seek that physical fulfillment outside of their marriage because they're getting everything that they need at home with the exception of that physical fulfillment. And while it will never be a husband of mine that will do that, it happens. A famous one was Elvis Presley. He loved Priscilla and valued her and treasured her as, a mother and his wife. But when it came to the physical intimacy of it, he was going after all the other girls. And I wish I could remember what book or article I found that in, but I thought that was very interesting. And it only stands out because my ex-husband was obsessed with Elvis and had actually brought that to my attention at one point. So I don't know. If I can find it, I'll link it. But if you've ever heard of that before with Elvis, I would be interested to hear your thoughts. But just to point out that I guess the thing that happens a lot of times, and I understand commonalities between true crime and cases, is that, if there's an affair, then chances are he tried to get rid of the family. But it's almost too commonly assumed now that the only reason that someone would get rid of their family is to go after another relationship. And I feel like when you blanket it like that, you miss so much that was underneath the surface. So that's why we do these deep dives. To summarize part 2, it's noted that Amber was not Scott's first affair, and in fact, Laci knew, yet never told her friends or her mother, contrary to their claims that if she knew about Amber, she would have mentioned it. It appears Scott and Laci moved to 523 Covina in Modesto and moved on from this transgression. They went on to own their own local business called The Shack, and ultimately, when they decided to sell it, they made a profit. Financially, they were pretty solid. Laci was set to inherit a large sum of money from her grandmother's passing, and so even with the baby on the way, they lived a pretty comfortable life. At some point, Scott decided that he didn't want to have kids. At the very least, he wasn't ready to begin trying for a baby, yet Laci was all in. They tried to get pregnant for some time, and it is common for couples to develop some struggles along the way when you're constantly monitoring ovulation and, peaks and temperatures and all of the things. And so Scott tells his friends that he was hoping for infertility. Laci gets pregnant. We see that she was very in tune with her body, and she didn't hesitate to call the doctor if, she was concerned about anything. We see a pattern of UTI and then a yeast infection, which would have halted physical intimacy between the two, most likely. During this time, Scott is off at a convention with a group of people, and he meets up with Sean Sibley, who ultimately introduces him to Amber Fry. Over the next few weeks, an affair begins. Laci continues to feel pretty ill, pretty often at home, and there was a lot of, bonding going on with Scott's new siblings around this time. So, keeping in mind that with the siblings comes background stories, comes questions about, why, and if she gave one up, then why does she have another one? Like, what does this mean? How is Scott processing all of this? Definitely something I think that played a bigger role in this case than what anyone's really kind of put together. The jewelry store is the only incident so far that I've discovered where, in my opinion, it points to Laci possibly suspecting or knowing about the affair. Now, we're about to go through this timeline, and this is what I was telling you to remember, and that we were going to come back to it. So I'm going to plug in the dates of Amber and Scott's affair with a few dates from the information above. By the end of September, Laci is finally healthy as far as the UTIs and infection goes. Yet by this time, we see Scott raises some questions with his conversations between Sean and Amber. On 10/24, Scott meets Sean Sibley at a convention for work. It's noted that he and Sibley were so flirtatious it made the others uncomfortable. Ultimately, the two were left at the bar together, where they continued with inappropriate dialogue. And this is according to people who were surrounding them. And given that they both were married or engaged, the people around them just felt like it was very inappropriate, and so they walked off and left them. Ultimately, Sean and Scott claimed that they were just talking, and in the end it resulted in Scott giving Sibley his number, and then like a day or two later she sent Scott Amber's number. 10:29, Laci discusses weight gain with her physician and if she is able to exercise. How about that? He's gone away for a convention, flirting with someone else, doing this whole bachelor thing, and then here comes 10:29, and Laci is discussing weight gain with her physician and asking if she's able to exercise. So it would be interesting to know if Laci presented this question or this subject for this visit, because it can be difficult with pregnancy. The weight starts to stack on, and sometimes you'll go from not even looking like you're pregnant to boom, you've got a little bump, and then it just keeps going. So especially if you are petite and have a small frame, and then right around this time, like especially if at the time your husband starts acting like he's disinterested when you start putting on the weight, then again, this is just speculation, but a woman often knows when a partner isn't looking at her the same. Scott's birthday was his first date with Amber. Keep in mind, he told Laci he couldn't be home for his birthday due to work. This is when he mentions to Amber about one-night stands and how he is tired of them. So, one-night stands. Let's just talk about that for just a second. It could mean exactly what it is, and that's that he has had one-night stands or hookups prior to meeting Amber. Or it could also be that he was getting frustrated with, he would have one night of intimacy with his wife and then she would get sick and then not feel good, and then you have to wait another 3 weeks before he could do anything again. So essentially one night stands with his wife. If that's what he's talking about, then look at the timeline of when she was having the infections. So Laci was left at home and she went to a friend's house to watch the final episode of The Bachelor. Ironically, Scott was out living like he was one. During this date, Scott mentioned selling the Land Rover and the boat. 12:1, Scott and Laci attend the family trip to Disneyland. This is after his first hookup with Amber. 12:2, Scott returns to Amber and has a picnic with her daughter and her. And this is the time when he mentions to Amber that he has a quote-unquote rigor mortis smile. Scott makes his lasagna for Amber, and oh, look at there, lasagna pops back up. 12:3, Scott picks up Amber's daughter from school, starts dinner, and helps Amber and her daughter pick out a Christmas tree. Just over there playing house. They even decorated the tree together, discussing each ornament. 12:4, Scott meets up with Amber for a lunch date. 12:8, investigator friend of Amber's tells her that Scott is married. This is Mr. Richard Bird. 12:9, Scott goes to Amber and is distraught and tells her that he was in fact married. He said at that time that he went out to the San Francisco Bay and felt guilty, so he went straight to her to tell her the truth. This is also the day that he bought the boat. So exactly what boat was he talking about selling before? Like, that would be a question for Scott or Amber. Were there two boats? He says Laci knew about a boat, so was there a different boat? 12:10, Amber's daughter had an emergency visit to the ER for bumping her head. I do believe in Amber Fry's book, she mentions that she had messaged Scott, but he was unable to come to her. But then the next day, Scott came and they went for a tux fitting for a benefit party that they were going to together. Scott slept over and slept with Amber that night. 12:12, Sean Sibley tells Amber about Scott being married. So here we have two people have already told Amber about him being married. 12:13, Laci gets a new manicure with a beautiful and festive red color and goes to pick up some jewelry she had repaired. 12:14, Laci attends her friend Stacy's Christmas party alone, while Scott attends the infamous Christmas party with Amber. Prior to the parties, Laci was observed being rather annoyed with Scott and moved away from him when he was trying to grab or rub her stomach. Scott stayed overnight with Amber and again, according to Amber, had unprotected intercourse. Now, this is what makes me think that Laci knew that day when she was picking up the jewelry. So she went in, one was to a pawn shop and one was for jewelry repair. And the report is that Scott was trying to wrap his arms around her and she was just annoyed and just pulling away. And that occurred on 12/14. So that's also the same day that she finds out that he's obviously leaving her to go out of town and that he can't go to this Christmas party on top of everything else that's been going on. And now he's staying with Amber, and here he is telling her that he doesn't want any biological children, yet you ding dong, Amber's telling you that she wants more kids, and now you're going to have unprotected intercourse. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. At 12:15, Scott left Amber around noon. At this time, I'll conclude the drafted timeline, just because I'll come back probably in another video and really just put together that timeline the best that I can, much like I did with the Watts. So, what are your thoughts? I know with these awful crimes, the question is often why. Comes up every time. Aside from calling him names and just putting a bunch of fluff in the comments, knowing the medical history of the pregnancy, do you think it's possible Scott was already having one-night stands with other women? Do you think what he was referring to was every time he had intercourse with his wife, she gets sick and then suddenly out of commission for 3 weeks? Was he really so over his life with Laci, or was Amber just another notch in his belt? Again, were the one-night stands just like every time he would be intimate with his wife, she would get sick and then he would just get frustrated because he was more acclimated to having it more? And so when he couldn't get it at home, he turned to Amber, and she just, she was just another notch. And, or do you think that he really was, out there with different women? And I say that, I don't really know how I feel about that, because during the time of the trial and everything, I feel like the hype was so big, and this was back when the paparazzi and tabloids would pay millions of dollars for your story. So I have a hard time believing that if other women had one night stands with Scott, that they didn't come forward. Especially 20 years ago, with how much money you could have been paid for that story. So I really do think that I lean more towards, her medical history plays a role in where things started shifting and changing when it came to their intimate life. Could it be that after learning about the children, his own mother gave up so she could start over? Was this his validation to do the same? And then the next time, he was making it known that while Amber had a daughter, he was okay raising her, but he did not want any biological children. Do you think the biological factor played a larger role? Could it be his own psychological discord with his mother's family heritage, which is worth looking into, that made him think continuing the family tree was the ultimate mistake? Many questions, and there are more discussion topics to add to these, but for now, drop your comments below and let me know what you're thinking. Please keep them objective and respectful, and don't hesitate. If something stood out to you and maybe it's missing a piece, or maybe it was an incomplete sentence or something, leave it in the comments below. I do my best to edit it so that doesn't happen, but if it did, drop it in the comments. I'll do my best to answer, and it's probably floating around in my notebook somewhere. But thank you so much for being here, and until next time, please like, share, and subscribe.
Can you tell she's pregnant? Look at that stomach. It's really sticking out. That's not mean. That's being nice because it's not.